Hey guys, how's it going? So UFC 314 is happening this weekend and this is a banger of a card, so I'm going to run through it and give you guys my picks and predictions for every one of the fights. Long one today, so let's just jump straight into it. Opening up the card on the early prelims is Nora Cornolle versus Hailey Cowan. So Cornolle coming off a really close win over Cavalcanti where she just got beat. I thought this was mainly just due to her getting outstruck in the third and sort of failing takedowns later in the second and third round. Very close, and to make it close with someone like Cavalcanti I think is pretty impressive. Before that she had a very dominant performance over Melissa Mullins where she just absolutely bullied her on the feet. However, she didn't make weight for that fight, so that does put a little bit of an asterisk on that win. But she does have some really good striking and she's not afraid to take it to the ground as well. She's just a very well-rounded fighter. Hailey Cowan had a very close fight in the Contender Series that got her into the UFC. It ended up going a split decision her way. I honestly thought she lost that one, but either way, got into the UFC, and her first fight within the UFC, not only did she not make weight, but she had a pretty bland performance where she just got outstruck on the feet and, you know, only really looked good briefly in her wrestling. But when you don't make weight for a fight and don't put on a dominant performance, it is kind of concerning. I think Cowan's striking is miles worse than Cornolle's, and I just don't see her wrestling being enough to win the fight convincingly. So for that reason, I'm going with Nora Cornolle by a decision win. Next up the card is Tresean Gore versus Marco Tulio. So Tresean Gore, weirdly dangerous with standing guillotines. In fact, that's how he won 2 of his last fights, was by these standing guillotines, which he somehow manages while in standing position to lock up really tight. He actually beat Antonio Tricoli and then especially Josh Fremd with these standing guillotines. Outside of that, he does often get beat on the feet in his fights, but his wrestling is sort of an equalizer and does sort of neglect the striking threat of his opponents when it comes to decisions. Marco Tulio, he had a brutal knockout win over Ihor Peteria recently, I think it was the start of this year, and he looked really good on the feet leading up to that finish. He also got a really impressive spin kick body TKO in the Contender Series fight, and it really just showed the power that he has in both his hands and his legs, and he's very explosive when he releases. And I think the power of Tulio will be too much for Gore in this fight, and as we've seen with his fight with Cody Brundage, Gore doesn't really have the most amazing chin, so for that reason I'm going to have it Marco Tulio by around 1 KO. Next up is Sumudaerji versus Mitch Raposo. So Sumudaerji currently on a 3-fight losing streak. He had a decently close fight with Charles Johnson that he ended up losing, mostly due to Johnson's wrestling, but before that he got dominated both on the feet and in the wrestling by his last 2 opponents before that one. I think it was Tim Elliott and of all people Matt Schnell, which is kind of concerning. His biggest flaw is his wrestling, where he'll often get submitted if he versus someone with above average grappling. Moving on to Mitch Raposo, speaking of above average grappling, he's coming off a loss to Andre Lima, which wasn't as close as the split decision would lead you to assume, but he did stand and bang with a very dangerous striker in Lima. His wrestling also looked very good in that fight and was what most likely made it so close. He was winning dominantly in the wrestling department, and overall I think Sumudaerji has better striking, but when it comes to the wrestling and grappling and the submission threat, I think that Mitch Raposo has this one, and I could 100% see a submission on the table. So for that reason, I'm going with Mitch Raposo by a round 2 submission. And closing out the early prelims, we have Sedriques Dumas versus Michal Oleksiejczuk. So Dumas, very sound fighter overall. He doesn't really rely heavily on one specific skill set. He had a very good fight against Dennis Tululin where he had the edge in both the striking and wrestling. Before that, he did get knocked out by Ruzaboev, who is a really good fighter, so not the worst of losses, but it does show sort of his ability of being finished against high power hitters. He did also get out-wrestled by proficient wrestlers such as Cody Brundage, so while he's good everywhere, if he versus someone who's either really powerful or really good at grappling, he most likely will lose. Michal Oleksiejczuk's most recent fight was against Sharabullah, where I think he had the closest fight with Sharabullah outside of MVP. And outside of that fight, he did get submitted by Kevin Holland with an armbar, and of all people got submitted by Michel Pereira, who is just a pure striker, so I don't know how that happened. There is a big weakness in his ground game. However, he is the strongest on the feet and possesses some decent power, and we saw that with his TKO over Chidi Njokuani, where that's an impressive win because Njokuani is no slump. And while Dumas' wrestling does present a threat to Oleksiejczuk, Dumas isn't really known for his submissions, and I believe that Oleksiejczuk's power will just be too much for him in this fight. So for that reason, I have Michal Oleksiejczuk by around 2 KO. And Opening the prelims, we have Darren Elkins versus Julian Erosa. So Elkins is coming off a decently good win against Daniel Pineda. Not the best of opponents, I know, but he did look busier on the feet and scored a few takedowns in that fight. However, worryingly, Pineda almost sunk in 2 submissions on the ground, showing that while Elkins can get takedowns, he often does give up dominant position and risks sort of putting himself in these positions to get submitted. He had a similar situation in his fight against Jonathan Pierce, where he looked good on the feet, but the minute he got on the ground, he sort of got reversed and dominated. Julian Erosa, very skilled grappler who is coming off a win over Christian Rodriguez, who is known to sort of fraud check prospects. And he was arguably winning on the feet before submitting Rodriguez at the end of the first. Same situation with Ricardo Ramos, where he did get taken down but very quickly turned the tides and got another first round submission. He did get finished in the first round with a TKO against Fernando Padilla, which on paper looks really bad, but that stoppage was ridiculously early. He was getting back up to the feet and ready to strike again when it got called off. And overall, while I think Elkins' wrestling will fare better than most of Erosa's opponents, I think Erosa's submission threat is just too big in a fight like this, and I don't think he's bad on the feet either. So for that reason, I'm going with Julian Erosa by round 2 submission. Next up on the card is Jim Miller versus Chase Hooper. So Jim Miller, he had a pretty good win at 307 recently with a standing guillotine that he jumped and submitted Damon Jackson with. It was such a good jumping guillotine that even Poirier would probably shed a tear. Outside of that, however, he has some pretty unimpressive performances and some really bad losses as well. Most prominent was his loss against King Green at UFC 300, where he just got absolutely battered on the feet. Yeah, he looked really unimpressive in that fight, and before that he did get a somewhat impressive win over Gabriel Benitez, where he managed to submit him. But that fight was pretty even up until that point, and I just think it's time for Jim Miller to hang up the gloves. While that Damon Jackson win was good, I don't think it shows that he's back, and he was actually getting beat on the feet by Jackson up to that point. Chase Hooper, he's on a 4-fight win streak, and 3 of those wins were coming from submissions, and 2 of those 3 wins in the first round. He's very dangerous, and he has sort of a finish or get finished mentality, and these submission wins are over big names like Clay Guida, Borshev, Jordan Levitt. Like, they're not slouches that he's versing, and I can see him entering the top 15 sometime soon. And overall, I just can't see Jim Miller being able to finish Hooper, and if you can't finish Hooper with a KO or sub, he is going to find a way to submit you, and I think that's what's going to happen in this case. I think Chase Hooper's going to get this one done, and I think it's going to be by a round 2 submission. Next up on the card is Xiaonan versus Virna Jandiroba. Now, this is pretty low for a number 1 contender fight between these strawweights, but it just shows how stacked the card is. So Xiaonan, one of the best strikers in the strawweight division with some very impressive power in her hands. She's knocked down people such as Andrade, which is pretty difficult to do, and even in her fight with Zhang Weili, she actually scored a knockdown, so that's pretty decent striking for strawweight. However, recently she had an incredibly dull performance against Tabitha Ricci at UFC Michal, I think it was, who I thought this fight was just going to be a one-way beating. It would, style-wise, it would make sense for Xiaonan to be very successful on the feet, but at the end of the fight it was fairly even going into the decision. On top of that, she does struggle when her opponents choose to wrestle, with it being the main reason she lost her fight with Darren, and in the Weili fight she literally got submitted before the bell ended, and you could tell when she stood up that she was very much out of it prior to the bell going off. Moving on to Virna Jandiroba, she's a very dangerous submission artist on the ground, where she will find any opening for an armbar or a choke, with her performance most recently against Lemos showing how quickly she can sort of turn the tides of a fight and submit you on the ground. She's decent on the feet and made it very close in her fight against Godinez, but will often get outperformed on the feet by more proficient strikers, such as in the case with the Marina Rodriguez fight, where especially in the 3rd round she was just getting beat up on the feet. But I think her grappling is enough most of the time to make a fight a lot closer when it gets to the decision, if not finishing the fight, as she's always sort of looking for a submission on the ground and always presents that threat. So for that reason, I'm going to say that Virna Jandiroba is going to get this one done, and I'm going to say it's going to be by a round 3 submission. And closing out the prelims, we have Dan Ige versus Sean Woodson. So Dan Ige, very dangerous and explosive striker who will make a fight very sort of scrappy and dirty. If it means that he can land a big sort of shot in a blitz or a combo that he's throwing. He looked really good in the first round of his Lerone Murphy fight recently at 308, and he managed to knock down Murphy, which given his most recent fight with Emmett, I think that's a pretty impressive task. If Emmett can't knock Murphy down, I'm surprised that Ige could. And then later in the round he did slow down and it caused him to lose that fight in the second and third round, but it was a decently close fight against a Murphy who's 16-0. His fight with Lopes before that was on 2 hours notice and up 2 weight divisions. It was sort of at welterweight, so I don't want to put too much weight on that one, pun intended. Before that, he had an insanely brutal knockout over Andre Fili, which I'll get back to because I think it's incredibly important when assessing a matchup like this. Sean Woodson, he's coming off a knockout over Fernando Padilla. I don't think Fernando Padilla had an amazing chin, so yeah, but before that he did show some really good boxing and every shot did have decent power behind it. Outside of that, he had a very close striking battle with Alex Caceres and an insanely close split decision win over Charles Jourdain, who, may I remind you, is pretty small for featherweight, and it's kind of concerning. Jourdain actually moved down to bantamweight recently, and he looks a lot better in that division. He kind of fits in a bit more. Dan Ige, pretty big for the division, so I don't want to weigh up that Charles Jourdain win that much. But it's mainly Ige's win over Andre Fili, which is convincing me that he's going to win this fight, because Woodson and Fili are sort of similar. They're both very tall, lanky strikers who rely a bit too much on their reach to sort of beat smaller individuals. And I think it will go very much the same way. I think Dan Ige will sort of make it a bit scrappy and blitz in and be a bit too in your face for Woodson, who will sort of be relying on his range and his height to win the fight. And I can see Woodson getting caught with something very big when this happens. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Dan Ige for this one, and I think he's going to get it done by a round 2 KO. Moving on to the main card, we have Nikita Krylov versus Dominick Reyes. So Nikita Krylov, he's been in the company forever now. He made his debut all the way back in 2013, so almost 12-ish years fighting for the UFC, and throughout his career he's fought some really tough opponents. Most recently he did get a round 1 submission over Ryan Spann, which, while impressive, I don't really see Reyes being submitted. There will probably be wrestling, but I can't see a submission finish from either fighter. He is decent on the feet, and his fight against Volkanovski did show that he's capable of mixing up striking and wrestling to often win decisions. And before that, he had a really quick knockout over Gustafsson, but keep in mind this was Gustafsson's last fight, and the 2 fights before that one, Gustafsson looked really bad. He kind of fell off after fighting Jones. And overall, I think that Krylov has some pretty good striking, but doesn't particularly have much power, and will often lean on his wrestling to sort of mix things up in a fight and take home decision wins predominantly. Dominick Reyes, after his fight with Jones, that he arguably won, in fact, I'm going to put on the table, I think he dominated Jones, but whatever. He went on a downturn in his career, and I thought that it was really spelled the end of Reyes with some really bad KO losses to Blachowicz. The Haskell one was especially bad, that spinning back elbow. Oof. And then he proceeded to lose to Spann as well, who at the time was seen as sort of a can. Spann's decent, but not amazing. But then he came back and absolutely dog-walked just Dustin Jacoby and got a first round KO. He knocked him down twice in that fight and then made quick work of finishing him. And then at 310 he came back, and a lot of people were saying that was a one-off performance, but then he beat the brakes off Anthony Smith, who, granted, leading up to that fight was going through sort of, I think his friend died, and he just wasn't in the right headspace that fight. But either way, it was just one-way traffic from Reyes. And I do think Reyes is back, and I think he's ready to sort of prove that he is a contender within that light heavyweight division. So for that reason, I'm going to Dominick Reyes by a round 2 KO. Next up is probably the most hyped up fight on the card by the way the fighters have been acting. Bryce Mitchell versus Gene Silva. Bryce Mitchell, most recent win was over Kron Gracie, which was pretty much a write-off because all Gracie would try and do was pull guard. Even when they were standing, Gracie would come in, hug Bryce Mitchell and try and pull guard on him while they were standing, which ultimately led to him getting slammed and knocked out. Before that, Mitchell got finished pretty early by Josh Emmett in a very brutal fashion, and it wasn't until the Dan Ige fight where we sort of got to see how Bryce Mitchell fought, really. In that Ige fight, he showed decent striking, but what I think won him that fight was the wrestling and the sort of submission threat he posed. He is one of the 3 fighters in the UFC to get a twister submission, so it shows that he does have an eye for these submissions and will catch when he can sort of sink one in and end a fight early. Speaking of Gene Silva, coming out of the Fighting Nerds camp, so there is a large amount of hype sort of behind Silva coming into this fight. He finished a lot of his fights in the UFC by knockout, or in the case of Drew Dober, a round 3 doctor's stoppage, but that was mainly because he broke his hands on Dober's incredible chin. And the power in his hands also can't be denied. Just the Baghdasarian fight, he absolutely just knocked him down and then finished him. An area that is concerning in his fights is his takedown defense. We saw in the Charles Jourdain fight that Jourdain, who is known pretty much as being a pure striker, was sort of resorting to shooting in and landing takedowns that were turning the tide of the fight because he was actually landing them. But he did end up getting finished while shooting in for a takedown, so there is that to take into consideration. But I do think the power of Silva will be too much for Mitchell, and we've seen that Mitchell can get finished given enough power. Don't get me wrong, I could see Mitchell getting a very early submission in this fight, but I just see it more likely that Gene Silva will sort of land this one shot that will put Mitchell out. And I think that Gene Silva is going to take this one in the second round by a knockout. Next up on the card is Yair Rodriguez versus Patricio Pitbull, who's making his debut in the UFC on this card. So, Yair Rodriguez is coming off 2 losses in his most recent fight, one being a very close fight against Brian Ortega, 1-1 into the third, but he ended up getting taken down and submitted in the third round. His other loss was against a champ at the time, Alexander Volkanovski, where he looked pretty unimpressive that fight, and he just got picked up, slammed on the ground, and then TKO finished. Outside of that, his fight with Emmett was very dominant, and he managed to finish that one with a submission on the ground, where he won the interim belt to later fight Volkanovski, but didn't jeopardize. And his first fight with Ortega before that, he looked really, really good in that one, and it got stopped because of an injury, but I had Yair dominating in that fight regardless. But his biggest skill overall is just the pace he pushes. It will most likely cause fighters to sort of give into the pressure that he puts on them. And with his style of striking being so sort of unique, where he's throwing crazy stuff all the time, his opponents usually struggle to get a read on him and will often get caught by something big. Speaking of, Patricio Pitbull, he's one of the most dominant Bellator champs, becoming double champ through finishing Michael Chandler, so there's a little crossover for you. And he did that in the first round. He's very slick on the feet with definitive power behind like every punch he throws, but he's also a threat on the ground, and he has some good submission wins in his earlier Bellator bouts. However, as of recent, he has gone to more and more decisions, with his most recent loss being at Ryzen when he took on Chihiro Suzuki, where he got finished pretty badly in that second round, put away badly. This will be a tough fight though, and I think between both fighters it's going to get very close at certain points. But I just see Yair having a sort of unique style that Pitbull won't be able to get a read on, and with this higher sort of skill ceiling within the UFC, combined with sort of how tricky Yair is to figure out most of the time, I just don't think Pitbull will be able to do enough to win this one. So I have this one going to Yair Rodriguez, but I think it's going to be a late round finish, so I'm going to say Yair Rodriguez by a round 3 KO. And now the co-main event, Michael Chandler takes on Paddy Pimblett, and what a challenge for Paddy Pimblett this is. Michael Chandler had a pretty horrendous record within the UFC. He's 2-6 currently. But he is very unpredictable and always brings sort of excitement to all of his fights, which sort of gives him a bit of favoritism. He kind of gets to fight these higher ups. He does have that iconic knockout against Tony Ferguson where he shuts the lights off with a front kick. But outside of that and the Dan Hooker fight, he hasn't really demonstrated as much power as people have sort of hyped him up to have. Everyone's talking about this, if he lands one shot, he'll absolutely murder this person. But he hasn't really shown that in any of his fights outside of Ferguson and Hooker. He couldn't even finish Charles both times they fought, which I think Charles sort of has the worst chin out of all of his opponents, so a little bit concerning there. But he is a really good striker, and he does put a lot of power behind everything he throws. But where he shines especially is his ability to sort of conserve energy and keep his explosiveness during later rounds of a fight. Paddy Pimblett, coming off probably his best win in the UFC against Bobby Green at 304, where he submitted him within the first round, also broke his arm. And throughout his UFC, he has racked up a lot of submission victories, with most of them coming in the first or second round. He did have that very, very close fight with Jared Gordon, where he sort of demonstrated that on the feet he will more likely than knock out Struck, and his main area of dominance really is his ground game that he should really stick to. In this fight, it is going to sort of be a battle of Paddy Pimblett's submission threat versus Chandler's power in his hands. So it is kind of hard to predict this just based off like who's better, because they're each better in their respective areas. One of the main problems though that I see with Paddy is that we don't really know how good his stamina is going into later rounds. In that Ferguson fight, by the third round, and even he admitted it, he was exhausted, and going into the third round, he looked absolutely just gassed. And it doesn't really fare well for someone like Chandler, who has shown that in round 5 and 4, but predominantly round 5, especially in that second Charles fight, he can turn on at any point in the fight, and he can turn the tides very easily in those later rounds. And in addition to this, we really haven't seen how Paddy's chin is. It's never really been tested by someone the likes of Chandler, so we don't know how much punishment he will be able to take in these later rounds. I could see a Paddy Pimblett early submission win on the table, but more likely than not, I see a late Chandler finish or a decision, but I'm gonna lock in Michael Chandler by a round 4 KO. And now we arrive at the main event. Alexander Volkanovski fights for the featherweight title against Diego Lopes. This is a banger. This card's amazing. Alexander Volkanovski, one of the most dominant featherweight champs who has ever done it. Arguably the GOAT of featherweight, depending on how you see it, but recently, yeah. He did have a fall from grace against Islam Makhachev in their rematch where he sort of got knocked out cold, and then very shortly afterwards went in to fight Ilia Topuria for the featherweight belt, where he got knocked out cold again. And at the time we didn't really know, but against someone like Ilia, it's really bad that they let Volk turn around that quickly. But given some rest, and he has taken quite a big rest break and sort of the need to not rush back into these fights half prepared, I think in this fight we're going to see a way more dangerous Volk. We're going to kind of see him as he was when he was champ. And speaking of, his fight over Rodriguez, where he looked very decent on the feet but also shone in the wrestling, I think it points towards how he'll look in this fight, where on the feet he'll sort of strike and stand and bang with these very dangerous strikers, but he's not afraid to sort of take down his opponent and use that to get some good ground and pound in. He doesn't usually go for submission, so I don't really see that in this fight. But I do see him potentially trying a takedown to get some more damage on the ground, if not just standing and banging. We saw it in the Holloway trilogy that they had. He's not afraid to sort of stand against opponents who are taller than him, and he will often more than not land on these opponents. But granted, it is kind of hard to tell how hard he hits, because with Max's granite chin, he's never getting knocked out, so we don't know if Volk has that knockout power. But overall, I think his biggest strength in this fight is his striking, and if he's not afraid to take down his opponent, he could get some good ground and pound, but I think he should stick to the feet. And as a wrestler, it's more defensive than offensive, with the Makhachev fight proving that on the ground he can survive, but he's not going to get any submissions. Moving on to Diego Lopes, he is very, 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 very well rounded. He's has very few weaknesses that you can actually exploit, and in the Ortega fight at UFC Noche, he looked incredible. He knocked Ortega out arguably before sort of waking him up with a follow-up hook that he threw, but I think if he didn't throw that hook, Ortega would have been asleep. And later in that fight, he was ragdolling Ortega in the wrestling department as well, so very well rounded. He had a decently close fight with Dan Ige at 313, but as I said before, considering it was a catch weight that was pretty much equivalent to welterweight, and he was sort of training for Ortega, who stylistically was very different to Ige, I don't think we should put too much weight on that fight. Outside of that, he is a very dangerous fighter, being able to put away both Sadiq Youssef and Pat Sabatini incredibly quickly in the first round, and he does have a nasty submission win before that in the first round as well, so very dangerous in every sort of area, and every moment of the fight, Volk's going to have to watch out from being caught by Lopes. I think another thing that is going to be incredible for Lopes in this fight will be his clinch game. In the clinch, he's incredibly dangerous, throwing these hooks and uppercuts, and like with Sadiq Youssef, usually they're enough to put you down, if not put you to sleep. And I can really see him doing this to Volk, and even if Volk's not out, I can see Lopes diving on him and potentially threatening a submission like an armbar. And what he does a lot is he'll threaten a submission and then give it up and use that to get some ground and pound that will probably finish his opponent, because he has a lot of power behind him. And I can see that happening in this fight, so I'm going to go with Diego Lopes, and I'm going to say he's going to get this one done by around 3 KO. So that's it, guys. Those are my predictions for UFC 314, Volkanovski versus Lopes. Oh, what a great card this is, man. As you know, the drill, my picks, Cameron's picks up on the screen right now. We actually differentiated pretty heavy on this event, so it's going to be interesting to see sort of who gets a better prediction score in this one. This event is so good, man. It's so good to see sort of a stacked pay-per-view card where not much has gone wrong. Prates did get pulled off the card, but it's not really as bad as sort of 311 and 313. But yeah, very, very excited for this one. Can't wait to make the recap video, but yeah. Bye-bye!